Assalamu alaikum. So today I want to talk about this really beautiful ayah in Surah An-Najm, chapter 53. So this is 53:32. And there's a very interesting word in this ayah that I want to analyze. And I think overall, this ayah is a very good ayah to give us a definition of taqwa, or to illuminate the discussion about what is taqwa. But that's something we can come back to, inshallah. So this verse 53:32 says, الذين يجتنبون كبائر الإثم والفواحش إلا اللمم. Those who avoid or do ijtinab, which we can talk about that word more because I think that plays into the idea of taqwa. But those who avoid كبائر الإثم والفواحش, those who avoid the great or the big ithm, the big sins, and fawahish or obscene acts. إلا lamam. So this is the really interesting thing about this verse, because it makes an exception. Those who avoid the big ithm and fawahish except al-lamam. What is al-lamam? What does that mean? So if you look into the books of tafsir, for example, you'll find different explanations, potential explanation of this. A lot of people say it means small sins, right? So they avoid the big ithm and fawahish except for the small sins. But there are other explanations that people give. So some people say, for example, this is what preceded in Jahiliyyah, like before you were a Muslim. So they avoid the big ithm and fawahish, except lamam means except what they did in Jahiliyyah that they might not have avoided. So there are different potential explanations for this. But what really makes this interesting to me is, so my philosophy or my approach in studying the Qur'an is that every word in the Qur'an that we study has one central meaning, or what we would call al-aslul wahid, the one root meaning. And wherever we see that word in the Qur'an, it might have different shades or different nuances of meaning depending on the context, but the root or the fundamental meaning of the word is still there. The fundamental meaning of the word doesn't change. And so when I approach the study of any word in the Qur'an, I'm always trying to look for what is the central meaning that applies to everywhere that word is used. And I've found that to be a very useful tool in studying the Quran. So that's why I feel very strongly that it is one of the tools that we should use in our approach to studying the Quran. Because there are some who take a different approach where they interpret words strictly contextually. So meaning this word, the same word can mean completely different things in different places in the Quran. And me personally, I'm not really convinced of that approach because I think it makes the Quran kind of messy. Whereas if you look for the one central meaning of each word that you study, that applies regardless of where you find that word at, even though there could be shades of meaning that change depending on the context. If you look for that one central meaning, you will see that the Quran is a cohesive whole. It's a interrelated whole that where all the parts of it fit together. And I think this is supported by the ayah where Allah tells us, أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ الْقُرْآنِ, do they not contemplate the Quran? وَلَوْ كَانَ مِنْ عِنْدِ غَيْرِ اللَّهِ لَوَجَدُوا فِيهِ اخْتِلَافًا كَثِيرًا. And had it been from other than Allah, they would have found therein much ikhtilaf, much variation or much contradiction, much conflict, varying natures in its parts, right? So I think that verse tells us that the Quran is one whole and it should all fit together. So I think that approach is very valuable. So that's why I'm not completely convinced here that al-lamam illa lamam means small sins, because if we go to another verse in the Quran, which is in Surah Al-Fajr. So in Surah Al-Fajr, he talks about people consuming inheritance, and he's talking about it in a bad way if you look at the context, right? So he says, Kalla bella tukrimuna al-yatim. Nay, you do not, but you do not honor the orphans. وَلَا تَحَاضُّونَ عَلَى طَعَامِ الْمِسْكِينِ, and you do not encourage the feeding of the poor. وَتَأْكُلُونَ التُّرَاثَ أَكْلًا لَمًّا, and you consume the inheritance أَكْلًا لَمًّا, a consumption that's lamman. He describes the consumption as lamman, from the same root as lamam. Okay? So then when you go to the next verse, وَتُحِبُّونَ الْمَالَ حُبًّا جَمًّا, and you love wealth, حُبًّا جَمًّا, a love that is jam, They say jam means kathir, like, so you love it very much. So these verses seem to be talking about, first of all, bad qualities, and it seems to be talking about an excess in you consuming the inheritance because it's coupled with loving wealth, jamman, kathiran, loving it much, right? So here, aklan lamma doesn't seem to mean, and this is Surah Al-Fajr, verse 19, 89-19. It doesn't seem to be referencing something small, right? So I want to understand what is the connection between this word in these two verses, aklan lamman and illa lamam, right? So if we start with some of the Arabic meanings of this word, I think that will help us. So first of all, there's a few different things we'll find if we look in different Arabic dictionaries or Arabic discussions of this word. So I'll just share a couple that seems to me to be illuminating of this word and the meaning in these contexts. So first of all, some say they say aslu lamam or aslu lam is al jama, that the root meaning of lam means to gather together. So if you say lamamtu shay, I did lam to something, it means jama'atuhu, means I gathered it. In Arabic, if you say inna daraka lamuma, if you say your home is lamuma, from the same root lamuma, it means tulimmu nas ay tajma'uhum. It means it gathers the people. Your home is lamuma, it gathers the people. Another way we think about this in Arabic is if we say, for example, al-akilu yalumu tharid, yani fayaj'aluhu luqaman thumma ya'kuluhu. If we say about someone who is eating, and I think this way of thinking about it in Arabic will help us understand the ayat in Surah Al-Fajr where he says aklan lamma, that al-akilu, the one who is eating, yalummu atharid. So atharid is a kind of food. Yalummu atharid. So the one that's eating does this action of lam yalummu with atharid, a type of food. It means fayaj'aluhu luqaman, that he makes it into different morsels. Thumma ya'kuluhu, then he consumes it or eats it. So perhaps when he says وَتَأْكُلُونَ تُرَاثَ أَكْلًا لَمَّا, it means, number one, gathering together, but also how it says here, one of the Arabic usages of it is to take some food and to make it into different morsels and then to eat it. So the inheritance, you would expect potentially that it has various types of property or material or whatever it might be. It's not just one thing. So you take all this inheritance and you gather it together. You gather all the different types and you consume it. That's what Allah is blaming in that place. وَتَأْكُلُونَ التُّرَاثَ أَكْلًا لَمَّا, that you consume the inheritance, a consumption that is lam. Now, another interesting definition of this is by the scholar Az-Zajjaj, who said, Aslu lamam wa al-ilmam, the root meaning of al-lamam and al-ilmam is ما يعمله الإنسان المرة بعد المرة ولا يتعمق فيه ولا يقيم عليه, which means that the root meaning of lamam or al-ilmam is what a person does from time to time, but does not go deep into it and does not stay established upon it. So not doing it all the time. They do it from time to time. They don't go deep, nor are they established upon it. So these two meanings from Arabic, I think will help us illuminate the connection between these two verses. Number one, the idea that al-lam means al-jama, to gather, and someone who's eating makes some food into a bunch of different morsels and gathers it together and then eats it. We say yalummu, right? And then this meaning being something that a person does from time to time but doesn't go deep into it. But how do we connect those Arabic meanings and then connect these verses? So that's what we're going to talk about now. So first of all, as I just said, akla lamma from these definitions makes sense. You consume the inheritance, aklan lamman, meaning you gather all the inheritance, all the different types, and you consume it. Okay, so that makes sense. But how do we connect that to 53:32, where he says, الَّذِينَ يَجْتَنِبُونَ كَبَائِرَ الْإِثْمِ وَالْفَوَاحِشَ إِلَّا اللَّمَمْ. Those who avoid the big ithm, the big sins, and the big fawaahish, the big obscene things, except for al-lamam. So what does lamam mean in light of these definitions? So perhaps what lamam is referring to is it's not talking about necessarily smaller sins, but what it's saying is that the ithm and the fawaahish, the sins and the obscene things, the corruption in the world, will be so extensive and is so extensive because even from the beginning of time, when Allah said that He was going to, well, I wouldn't say it's the beginning of time, but even from the beginning of Allah addressing the angels with the human beings being placed upon this earth as a khalifa, what was the first thing that the angel said? أَتَجْعَلُ فِيهَا مَن يُفْسِدُ فِيهَا وَيَسْفِكُ الدِّمَاء. Are you going to place therein the one who is going to do corruption therein and shed blood? So from the very beginning, this was the nature of humanity. So al-ithm wal-fawahish, the corruption, the sins, the fawahish, is going to be so all-encompassing. That's where the idea of gathering, it's going to hit everything in the world. It's going to hit every place to the point where it's going to be very difficult for you to not be influenced by that in some kind of a way. So it's very likely that even if you don't do it all the time, or even if it's something that you don't stay, as he defined it, stay established upon, where you continue to do it, but it's likely that from time to time you could fall into something like that, right? So that's how you combine, I think, those definitions for lamam, illa lamam, because it has the meaning of gathering, because these things gather and cover the whole world. Like that one Arabic definition, it said, inna daraka lamuma, your home is lamuma. It yalummu nas tajma'uhum, talummu nas tajma'uhum. It gathers them all together. In the same way, al-ithm wal-fawahish is the same thing. It gathers and covers all of the people or all of the world. So therefore, the probability that you will be touched by it from time to time is a real thing, right? But the difference is, so when you read this whole verse, he says, الَّذِينَ يَجْتَنِبُونَ كَبَائِرَ الْإِثْمِ وَالْفَوَاحِشَ إِلَّا اللَّمَمْ. Those who avoid the great ithm and the fawahish except lamam. So except the things that you might fall into from time to time because of the comprehensive nature of corruption in the world. إِنَّ رَبَّكَ وَاسِعُ الْمَغْفِرَةِ. Your Lord is extensive in forgiveness. هُوَ أَعْلَمُ بِكُمْ إِذْ أَنْشَأَكُمْ مِنَ الْأَرْضِ. He is the most knowing of you when He brings you forth from the earth, or when He brought you forth from the earth. وَإِذْ أَنْتُمْ أَجِنَّةٌ فِي بُطُونِ أُمَّهَاتِكُمْ. And when you were fetuses in the wombs of your mothers. فَلَا تُزَكُّوا أَنفُسَكُمْ. So do not ascribe purity to yourselves. هُوَ أَعْلَمُ بِمَنِ اتَّقَى. He is the most knowing of the one who has taqwa. So this is a description of people who have taqwa. So then, what we can understand from this verse is the description of those who have taqwa is not that they won't ever do any of the big ithm or fawahish, but that if they do, it's lamam. It's just because they fell into it from time to time, just because of the comprehensive nature of corruption in the world. They slipped, they were influenced, they were in certain environments, but they always catch themselves. That's the difference with someone who has taqwa and someone who doesn't. It's not that they don't fall into it from time to time, but they catch themselves. And what supports this interpretation, there's a couple verses that I think supports this interpretation. They don't use the exact same words, but the concept is there. So if we go to chapter 7, verse 201. Chapter 7, verse 201, he says, إِنَّ الَّذِينَ اتَّقَوْا إِذَا مَسَّهُمْ طَائِفٌ مِنَ الشَّيْطَانِ تَذَكَّرُوا فَإِذَا هُمْ مُبْصِرُونَ. Those who have taqwa, when a ta'if, when something hits them from shaitan, تَذَكَّرُوا, they remember, فَإِذَا هُمْ مُبْصِرُونَ, and then they see right. So he didn't say those who have taqwa, nothing from shaitan ever hits them or touches them, as the ayah says, massahum. But he said the difference with those who have taqwa is that when it does touch them, they remember right? So they might fall into it from time to time. They forget. But tadhakkaru, they remember. فَإِذَا هُمْ مُبْصِرُونَ, then they see right. Meaning for a time they weren't seeing right. Follow me? So that the meaning of this verse, even though it doesn't use the exact words, but the meaning of it supports that interpretation of 53:32. الَّذِينَ يَجْتَنِبُونَ كَبَائِرَ الْإِثْمِ وَالْفَوَاحِشِ إِلَّا اللَّمَمْ. They avoid the big ithm and fawaahish, except lamam, except something that might hit them because of how widespread and pervasive corruption is. Another verse that supports this interpretation and how we connect these verses together is 3:135. And this is a description of those who have taqwa, because if you look at a couple verses up, 3:133, he talks about وَجَنَّةٍ عَرْضُهَا السَّمَاوَاتُ وَالْأَرْضُ, a paradise, a Jannah, whose width is the heavens and the earth, أُعِدَّتْ لِلْمُتَّقِينَ, which is prepared for those who have taqwa. And then when you read a couple verses down, so he goes a couple verses describing who are al-muttaqin, who are those who have taqwa. So when you go a couple verses down to 135, he says, وَالَّذِينَ إِذَا فَعَلُوا فَاحِشَةً أَوْ ظَلَمُوا أَنفُسَهُم. So they could do a fahisha. And those who do a fahisha or wrong themselves, right? So that supports that interpretation, that illa lamam in that verse is not necessarily not talking about doing a fahisha or even a big fahisha, because here he mentions it in general. وَالَّذِينَ إِذَا فَعَلُوا فَاحِشَةً, they do any fahisha. أَوْ ظَلَمُوا أَنفُسَهُم, or they wrong themselves. ذَكَرُوا اللَّهِ, they remember Allah. See, it's always a description of remembering. فَاسْتَغْفَرُوا لِذُنُوبِهِمْ, and they seek forgiveness for their sins. وَمَنْ يَغْفِرُ الذُّنُوبَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ, and who can forgive sins except Allah. وَلَمْ يُصِرُّوا عَلَى مَا فَعَلُوا وَهُمْ يَعْلَمُونَ, and they do not persist on what they have done while they know. See? So when you put all those verses together, to me that lends a lot of strength, along with the Arabic meanings of the word lamam, that lends a lot of strength to the interpretation that it's not necessarily talking about smaller sins, but it's saying even the bigger sins, it's not something they do continuously, and they don't go deep into it, but it's something that might touch them and affect them from time to time, just because they're people living in these sometimes corrupt environments. And Allah knows best. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.